All right. Good morning, everybody. I don't know how you feel, but I have to say I am a little tired after the last night. It was an exceptional, exciting election night in Germany. And usually I would say all other countries' elections are more exciting than ours, but I have to revise my opinion. This year was a really exciting election night. So welcome everybody to our Aspen International Press Luncheon. Germany has voted, and what next? What now? This is what we want to discuss today with a really esteemed panel. Before I introduce the panel to you, I just wanted to share a couple of impressions I had with regard to our elections and things which surprised me. And the first thing which surprised me is that it was, or slightly surprised me, that it was a really pretty bad election result for the CDU. They lost 9% of votes compared to the 2017 elections. Now, maybe all of you expected that. It surprised me a little bit that they fared so badly in the end. It also surprised me that the SPD caught up so tremendously after it lagged behind so much earlier on in the election campaign, and that it really made an incredible comeback. What also surprised me a little bit is how much the election campaigns were about people and not so much about programs, certainly not very much about foreign policy issues. What did not surprise me so much was the regional results of the elections, with a north-south divide and the east-west divide. But what really surprised me were the voting results according to age groups. And I don't know if you had a chance to look at it already, but what really surprised me were that the young voters and the first-time voters voted majorly Green. That didn't surprise me, and FDP, which very much surprised me. And I was not so much surprised that older age groups tended to vote more for SPD and the CDU. And what surprised me a little bit also were the results of the Greens. I thought that overall they would fare a little bit better, but they certainly still made the best election results in their history. So exciting surprises and not so much surprises. And as I said earlier, this is today our session where we want to look forward and want to specifically look at foreign policy issues. So let me introduce our panelists to you. And let me start with Cécile Boutelet. She is economics and business correspondent at Le Monde. Thank you so much for being here today, Cécile.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Our second panelist is Tom Nuttall. He is Berlin Bureau Chief of the Economist. Thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Melissa Eddy is Berlin correspondent of the New York Times. Thank you so much, Melissa, for being here today.
Happy to be here, Stormy.
And Faye Karaviti, she is foreign correspondent, Athens News Agency and Alpha TV. Thank you so much for joining us as well.
It's great to be here as well. Thank you.
And Jasper von Altenbockum, he is head of domestic politics, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. You are our German voice today on this panel. Jasper, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Hello.
And I would like to start with the same question to all of our panelists. And I would like to start with you, Cécile. And my question is, on a scale 0 to 10, with 0 for no changes and 10 for a lot of changes, how much do you think is the bilateral relationship between Germany and your country going to change after the elections? Cécile.
Well, I would say 5 because there are a lot of uncertainty. Depends on the general partners in the coalition, but maybe we can talk about it later.
Okay, I note that down. A good middle of of 5. Tom, how is the relationship going to change between the UK and Germany?
I think I'm going to give it a 1, possibly at most a 2, relative to where the relationship has been under Merkel. The first thing to figure out is to what extent can a bilateral relationship be forged from the ruins of Brexit. And I think from the German perspective, until the British government figures out how it wants to manage this Northern Irish issue, this long-term irritant in the Brexit discussion, these attempts to forge a bilateral relationship are going to have to wait.
Great, thank you so much. So I now noted down a 1, and if you're very courageous, you would give it a 2 maximum. Thank you. So Melissa, US-German relations, how much are they going to change?
I am giving it a 4 right now. I think because Scholz has been in Merkel's government, and because the SPD has been in government, it's not going to be that tremendous. Also because of the state of US and German relations. I think that there's some key issues that we're looking at. Nord Stream, NATO being one of them. Some of them are European. There's still the tariffs issue. There's certainly enough spaces for there to be progress made, but I don't know that Scholz is going to really be eager to upset everything very quickly.
Interesting. So I noted down a 4. And Faye, how much are our bilateral relationship going to change? You need to unmute yourself. Try it again.
Okay, so so whatever the coalition, I would say no more than 3. In case of a CDU-led government, to the worse. In case of an SPD-led government, probably to the better.
Wow, so many of you are expecting more continuity than big changes. Now let me turn to Jasper and have a look at the German side. How much do you think is German foreign policy going to change after the elections?
Well, I would say that in general there won't be too much changes in the substance of our foreign policy. But I would say, so I would, I'm more on the side of Tom. I would say 1 or 2 on the scale. And but when it comes to the style and to the way we will act in our foreign policy, then I would say it's 4 or 5. I mean, Laschet is a profound foreign policy expert. His whole career, he wanted to be a foreign politics expert, and that's his. That's what he really likes to do. On the other side, Olaf Scholz had so far only 1 chance to some profile and images in foreign policy, and that was on the EU level and with his finance policy. But he's not. I don't know. He do a lot to. So if it comes to a Trafficlight Coalition with him as chancellor, I would say the changes might be bigger than with Armin Laschet. Armin Laschet is a convinced European politician, and he will do a lot for the transatlantic relationship, I guess. So, and that's in the continuity.
Great, thank you so much. I think we have to work a little bit on the sound. Sometimes it sounds really good. Okay. Too far away, I think, from the computer or from the mic, it gets a little hard.
All right. Okay, I'll do my best.
Thank you so much. So we just heard lots of continuity and not the big paradigm shifts or changes. So let me come back to Tom, because you had one of the lowest ratings with regard to change. Maybe you can explain to us a little more in depth where we currently stand in the UK-German relationship, but also in the context of the whole geo-economic, geopolitical power game, with taking into consideration what just happened last week with the US, with AUKUS, and everything going on with the submarine deal.
Yeah, I mean, AUKUS is interesting. I was sort of watching the German reaction to this quite closely. Frankly, there wasn't much of one, certainly not publicly. There were sort of some statements of moderate support for the French position, the French fury, from some German officials, generally sort of junior ones. But actually, my sense, and I think this sort of sums up a lot about German foreign policy, is that some of the biggest concerns that you have in the German system about what's happened with this deal are simply a fear that the French will make life a lot more difficult inside the EU. So you had French officials saying, well, you can forget about doing a trade deal, the EU doing a trade deal with Australia, for example. There were some questions over whether the planned Trade and Technology Council discussion with the Americans would proceed, something which I think that some parts of the German establishment are quite invested in. And that's going to go ahead. And a lot of this stuff is sort of heat of the moment stuff that's going to fade away in time. But in a way, that's the point. You know, to what extent are the Germans thinking more strategically, more long term about what this means for the shift in power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region? We've had for I think a couple of years now a set of guidelines for German strategy in the Indo-Pacific. We also have. I think it was a day after the submarine deal was announced, the EU launched its Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, whatever you think of this new deal that's been done with the Americans, Brits, and the Australians, it clearly represents a paradigm shift in the way that security is going to be organized going forward in this part of the world in which Germany now claims to have an important strategic relationship. So it ought to be thinking about how it is going to position itself and how Europe is going to be positioning itself. I'm not really getting a strong sense of very much thought is going into that. Now, of course, it happened at the end of an election campaign where it's very difficult to make sort of long-term foreign policy strategic thinking. But to me, the instinct here is still, for the most part, to think about the sort of the short term and the tactical of what is this going to mean for how coherent the EU is as a negotiating bloc, rather than about these sort of big, tricky strategic questions. And then just a quick thought on the kind of bilateral relationship post-Brexit. I'll read you out something that Olaf Scholz has just said this morning. He was asked in a press conference, Britain is having all of these troubles now with a lack of drivers for trucks to bring in goods, and the British government has announced that it will issue some visas to European truck drivers to come in and help alleviate the shortages. Olaf Scholz was asked about this, and he said, "We can't send German truckers to Britain to help solve the crisis. We tried to convince Britain to stay in the EU where workers can move freely, and maybe they should think about making their wages more attractive." So I think that's a pretty sort of clear signal that you're not going to get, at least from an Olaf Scholz government, a radical change of perspective towards post-Brexit Britain in this bilateral relationship than we've had in the previous government. I think, frankly, that was pretty clear before the election. I think it's going to be clear after the election as well. This relationship has to be rebuilt from the ground up, and that's going to take a long time.
Great, thank you so much. Also for the look at the bilateral relationship. Just one follow-up question with regard to geopolitics and the Indo-Pacific. Do you think that the strategic relevance with regard to trade, but also with regard to foreign policy and security, is this something which members of the different parties are aware of in Germany, or is that something we still have to learn?
I mean, my sense is that it depends on who you're talking to. Like, it's quite interesting in Germany. You do find there are people in almost all parties who are thinking clearly and in a sort of an interesting way about how to get Germany, the German establishment more broadly, to think about national interest, to think about grand strategy, to think about emerging geopolitical competition and all of this sort of thing. And what's quite funny for me is that often when you talk to these people, you almost have a feeling that they often have more in common with each other than they might do with the establishment of their respective parties. And they are there, and they are sort of slowly forcing the conversation. I think AKK has done an interesting job as defense minister. But if you look at people in positions of power and decision-making authority, AKK feels like quite a sort of a lonely voice out there. You know, she's pushing an interesting and a difficult conversation. You don't always feel like she has the backing of that many members of her own party or of the German decision-making establishment more broadly. So things are moving, but they're happening very slowly. They're happening at a subterranean level. They're happening, frankly, in a very German fashion. And it's going to take quite a long time until we see a serious shift.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Tom. Let's jump on to the other side of the Atlantic, since we already talk about geopolitics and the Indo-Pacific. And so, Melissa, transatlantic relations. We were very hopeful after the Biden election that there would be a restart of the relationship. Now, the last couple of weeks were a little troubled. So what's going to happen now after our elections?
Well, I think exactly that point you make, Stormy, is what makes it so complicated. Everyone looked to Joe Biden here in Germany to really return to multilateralism, which he has done. But then the damage of the extremely chaotic exit from Afghanistan, where the Germans, I think, felt that the rug was just pulled out from under them because the Americans were racing to meet a deadline that they appeared in the end clearly unprepared to have met. And now it puts Germany in this very difficult position of, on the one hand, they're, extremely dependent on the U.S. militarily. On the other hand, they're realizing that has left them coming up quite short, because being dependent on the Americans is no longer what it used to be. At the same time, something that I find very interesting that is not being talked about here in Germany a whole lot is how dependent the Americans are actually on the Germans, because right now there are still 9,000 Afghans sitting on Ramstein Air Base. Their evacuation was delayed because of a measles outbreak, but nonetheless, no one has raised that really, I think because they didn't want to bring it up in the election, but it shows that this relationship actually does go both ways, something that the Americans are not always, really eager to talk about coming out of Washington. But then with the submarine deal, as Tom was just saying, we see that the Germans did not really have a very strong position. And there was some discussion, on the one hand, that emotionally our support is with France, but militarily we're strong with the US. And it seemed like this idea of really wanting to have their cake and eating it too. And that I think a new German government is going to have to figure out where they are positioning themselves vis-a-vis the United States and China. That, of course, is not only a German decision. It will depend heavily on the European Union and where France decides to be, which is at the moment a very complicated position, which is not going to make it any easier for whoever the next chancellor is to be able to sort things out. The one interesting thing about Olaf Scholz, of course, is that he went over to the United States. He went over to Washington. He had solid talks with Biden, and he and Janet Yellen sat down, and he got the Americans on board for this multilateral project of the global corporate tax agreement, which is a real initiative that could give him potentially some weight on the global stage, but at the same time with some of the tougher issues that we're looking at, including the other one being Nord Stream. If the Social Democrats wind up with the Greens in a strong position in their, whoever actually winds up with the Greens in a strong position in their government, the Greens are very against the Nord Stream 2 project, and that could further complicate the relationship with Washington.
This is really, really interesting, Melissa. Let me also ask you a follow-up question. Looking at the base of the parties, and specifically the SPD and the Greens, do you see a lot of love for the transatlantic relationship?
Love is a strong word.
Yeah.
I would be reluctant to say a lot of love. What I do find really interesting, though, is in both of the parties you mentioned, the SPD and the Greens, there is a strong young progressive strain. And if you look at the Squad, for example, in the Democratic Party of the United States, there is also a strong, very young strain. And unfortunately, I think that strain, because there's so many social issues and progressive issues that need dealing with in the United States, that focusing on foreign relations has not really been front and center of any of those young progressives. But in theory, it does raise an interesting question of, is there a potential that a new generation could actually sort of redefine what a transatlantic relationship could look like? That is purely hypothetical at this point. And right now, I think it will be more problematic with those young progressives coming out of Germany vis-a-vis where Washington is at than some great new revival, as cool as I think that would be.
Well, thank you so much also for reminding us that we do have to look also not just at the establishment, but also of the young political leaders waiting to take leadership positions.
And just real quickly, I'm going to cut in. That is one of the surprises that I found. I thought it was really interesting that the SPD actually, they grew by a lot of young new members of parliament and who are coming in. And that really, I'm wondering if that could have an impact, because compared to the US, where we saw when the Squad came in, when this group of young progressive Democrats came in and they've really been able to promote some of the issues, it does raise the question, what could that mean for the SPD if they get in government?
Oh yeah, thank you so much for pointing that out. That is really an important issue. So let me turn to Cecile. Our German-French relationship has not always been so super easy over the last years. And the relationship Merkel-Macron was solid, good, but also not without its confrontations. So how are the elections perceived over in France, and which kind of government would the French government like to see here in Berlin with regard to topics, but also people to work with?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an interesting question because, yes, the Merkel-Macron relationship hasn't been always very easy. It's a matter of rhythm, of ambition. And at the beginning, so 4 years ago, you had the big speech of the Sorbonne University, where Macron detailed big ambition and big plan for Europe. And on the other side of the Rhine, Merkel had no government. So she was blocked, and Macron waited like almost 6 months to have an answer. And at the end, it was a very disappointing answer for him. Nevertheless, I would say that the last 4 years have been very good time for French-German relationship, not at the first front, but on the economics and industrial politics. So we have a very Germanophile minister. He's called Bruno Le Maire, and he speaks very well German. He knows Germany very well, and he worked as well with Olaf Scholz. So as a result, you have seen this what Melissa mentioned before, this global tax, corporate tax agreement. And the other side, you had the industrial politics, which was very long time very taboo in Germany. But not in France. But in this case, you had a momentum also with the pandemics, where German industry and German economy ministry had seen that the European industry had to reinforce themselves, like with the chips problem and the battery problem. So you had strong policies, European policies, not just German, French, but also policy for whole Europe to develop those, so to work together on those issues. And of course, one of the big achievement of this dialogue has been the recovery fund after the pandemics. That was a moment where Germany and France had communicated very well together. And of course, now we have a moment of more concern because a new government comes, and it's not about Olaf Scholz or Armin Laschet, but as I said before, it's all about the junior partners, especially Christian Lindner and the Free Democrats. Why? Because Christian Lindner, as signalized, he is very much, he wants to stick to this fiscal policy orthodoxy. So don't touch the debts issue. He doesn't want to touch to the stability pact, so the debt criterion in Europe, in Eurozone. And so I think Paris is expecting what comes with this issue, because it's discussing, there are strong difference with the Greens, so it could be at the end, maybe I don't know, very creative and maybe more European solution in these issues. I think that's what Paris is expecting. That at least the debate about those policies, those fiscal policy, comes more, so that more arguments are coming. And I would say that I've seen by Olaf Scholz in his team, and I would underline what Melissa said before, that you have new young people in this ministry who have been studying in US, have been their career in the US, and they are bringing more move in the classical orthodoxy fiscal policy, that I think at least we could have a debate on in Germany and then in Europe, and it could be interesting in the next years, because that's what definitely Paris and Rome are expecting.
Great, thank you so much, Cécile, for this overview. I think we come back to the issue of the European Union and also financial issues and the prospect of a fiscal union when we talk about our future Minister of Finance. I think it's going to be very interesting how the coalition is going to look like and who is going to head our finance ministry. And since we are already talking about financial issues and the European Union, that's a great lead over to you, Faye. I remember during the time of the financial crisis and then the Euro crisis, Greek-German relations were not so great. I mean, because of our focus on fiscal austerity and the hardship which that also caused in Greece. On the other hand, I saw some polling data by ECFR on the popularity of Merkel, and she seems to regain some popularity, interestingly, also in Greece, which is surprising, but maybe not so surprising. So handing it over to you, Faye, where are we going to go in our bilateral relationship?
So first of all, let me say that Greece played absolutely no part in this election, which to me, as a Greek journalist and as a Greek native, it was a huge relief, I must say. So all in all, even though the current Greek prime minister and the outgoing chancellor never had a great chemistry between them, the two countries have actually normalized their relations for a few years now. So if nothing spectacular happens in the near future, I don't expect a great shift in the relations. But there's a paradox here, one more paradox when it comes to Greece. We have a single-party conservative government in Greece, a member of the European Popular Party, but they have been secretly praying for anything other than a CDU-led government in Germany, and even if even worse if they are paired with a liberal finance minister. So it all has to do with the Stability Pact and its upcoming review. And when a country has a sky-high public debt, as Greece does, it's bound to think that they will probably do better with a socialist point of view on the other side. So, moreover, the German center-left has always had friendlier positions when it comes to issues like fiscal policy, of course, and then the refugee crisis and Turkey and weapons exports, even maybe the World War II reparations, which we've been claiming for a few years now. So definitely Greece would be in favor of a socialist chancellor, but I don't think that our relations are in any way as fragile as they have been in the past decade.
Thank you so much for explaining that. How come that our relationship normalized in the last years?
Well, I think we put together some ground rules over the years. It took some hardship. It strained the Greek-German relations a lot. The media on both sides had played a great part in that, and not a good one, I might add. And then we did all what we were asked to do. It was as simple as that, and it got us to where we are today. Of course, nobody talks about debt today because of the pandemic, but the discussion will return eventually. And then, well, Greece has seemed to be, Greece is now governed by more, how to say that, reform prone government. So this helps a lot. And at the moment, we're experiencing a time of a big growth, financial growth. So if that keeps up, I don't anticipate any problems. But when the discussion comes to the Stability Pact, I do think that we might not see eye to eye with Germany and some other countries in the EU.
Interesting. So a little bit of trouble ahead. And that brings me back to Jasper. Well, as somebody following German politics very closely and looking at the different parties and also the different coalition possibilities, could you also lead us a little bit through what different coalitions could mean for foreign policy making of Germany?
I think the so-called Trafficlight Coalition will mean more, liberal finance politics and fiscal policy on a European level. There's just one reason to remain skeptical in this direction, because Lindner might be the finance minister in this coalition, because he will play the role of the corrective to the more leftist tendencies in this coalition. And that makes things more complicated on a European level, but also on the domestic level. On the other side, there will be a lot of continuity with Armin Laschet as chancellor. And in both cases, climate policy will play a much bigger part than under Angela Merkel. And I don't see really differences in this respect between those two coalitions. When it comes to Russia, for example, that is maybe the most exciting part of the coalition negotiations, because the Social Democrats are, not as friendly towards Russia than as they were in the 70s and the 80s. On the other hand, Armin Laschet is a very pragmatical politician. But when it comes to China and Russia, he has to remain a little cautious because the Greens are much more critical towards the existing foreign policy than the conservatives or the liberals. But as I said, in general, there won't be too much changes. But I mean, Laschet is a politician, I would say, who is much more in the continuity of Helmut Kohl than Angela Merkel, and that means he will try to build bridges within the EU and beyond the EU. And his style is much more on a person-to-person politics. So he will try to get some friends among politicians in foreign countries. And that's a much more pragmatical approach towards foreign policy than we have it, and then we will have it under a Trafficlight Coalition.
So Jasper, you, if I get that correctly, you are not discarding the possibility of a continuation of the Grand Coalition or Jamaica coalition, because you have repeatedly come back to Laschet and talking about his foreign policy stance. So your assumption is not he is out. He could be in.
I don't know. I think today he made his first mistake, I would say. He had to try to become the chairman of the members of parliament of his faction in the parliament. He didn't do that so far. I don't know. Maybe we know more tomorrow, but he has to. Well, the party has to be unified behind him. So he has to manage what he couldn't manage during the election campaign. And the first thing he had to do is to bring the faction behind, bring all the members of parliament, of the CDU and the CSU behind him. And if Ralf Brinkhaus remains the chairman, he can't really guarantee that. So this is his first weak point, I would say. But of course, I mean, Jamaica is as possible as the Trafficlight Coalition. There's no doubt about that.
Great, thank you.
And I don't wish to have the Grand Coalition back. I mean, this would be the worst case, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there was at least seems to be agreement among the voters that is something they did not want.
They want to have change. And I would say, I mean, to be honest, I mean, I'm representing a conservative newspaper, but to be honest, a real change would be the Trafficlight Coalition. And that would clarify some landscape. And for us, it's more interesting than a Jamaica journalistic perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much. And now it's also the time for our participants to join in and ask questions. And you do so by raising your electronic hand, which you can do under the little button of reactions. And then I would call on you and give you the floor to ask your question. You could also send it in the chat box, but since this is as intimate as it can be on Zoom, but a small enough group so that I could actually give you the floor. So don't be shy and raise your electronic hand. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions coming in yet. So we do have several younger participants, which I'm seeing here among our list of participants. So this is also a possibility for our young foreign policy aha. And Emily is the first one who is going to break the ice. Emily, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, my question isn't like perfectly worked out now, of course, but I thought it was very interesting that all of you talked a lot about policies, of course, But what stood out for me as well is the fact that personality and just this sort of personality cult is more and more becoming important in Germany as well. And I was wondering, just your assessment, is that a result of 16 years of Merkel being so present in German politics, or is that just generally a development that we have to take into consideration? Because of course, like Christian Lindner as a potential financial minister is very interesting, but I'm wondering if we're moving closer to something like Le Pen versus Macron, Biden versus Trump down the line in Germany, and sort of what your view on that is. And that is a question to everyone, I guess, because it doesn't apply to just one country.
Great, thank you so much. Back to you, Tom.
Yeah, two questions and two answers. On the second question, is Germany becoming more polarized? I think the answer to that is pretty clearly no. And thank God for that, because one of the things I find so interesting about this result is, while on the one hand, you've got this increasing fragmentation of the vote, and the two Volkspartei and the Christian Democrats and the SPD combined got about half of the vote yesterday, which is much less than they've ever got before. On the other hand, that fragmentation is not leading to a strengthening of the extremes. The AfD, I think, was pretty much flat on its 2017 result. And of course, Die Linke had a terrible night. What you're actually seeing then is sort of complicated, but it's a fragmentation of the center. So the two old people's parties are shrinking. The Greens, although they feel disappointed, had a very good night in historical terms, and the FDP remain a strong party. So actually, this for me is the great legacy of Angela Merkel, is the sort of the Merkel-Mitte, these big group of voters in the center that she was so successful in mobilizing, and that the other parties have sometimes struggled a little bit to mobilize. That is where the center of gravity is in in German politics. I was going to make the comparison to France, where, who knows, Cécile obviously can talk about this in more detail, but we may be headed towards another Macron versus Le Pen vote next year. And that represents an extremely stark choice about the future of that country. Here, the center remains extremely strong, and we'll all get very excited about it. Will it be Jamaica? Will it be Trafficlight? But at the end of the day, Germany is going to have a strong democratic government of the center. And I think that that's something that the rest of Europe can be very happy about.
Great, thank you so much. Before I hand over to Jasper again, Tom, the movement towards the center and the fragmentation of the center, is that going to make governing more difficult or more easier in a coalition?
I think you'd have to say it's going to be harder for the straightforward reason that we're almost certainly headed towards the first three-party government at federal level since the 1950s. We all know it's going to take a long time to get a coalition deal. The FDP and the Greens disagree about almost everything. Well, they disagree about a lot anyway. So that in a formal sense, that fragmentation is absolutely going to make things harder. On the other hand, as these parties are all parties of the center, although when you're kind of immersed in German politics, you're really focused on the differences between them and what do they say about the Schuldenbremse or the Stability and Growth Pact. I think if you do an international comparison, then you will see that the differences between these parties who are going to find themselves in government is not vast, it's not insurmountable, and that because these parties are all ultimately parties of the center that agree on Germany's fundamental disposition and its position in NATO and the EU and the social market economy, that at the end of the day, it shouldn't be too difficult for them to find the common ground they need to put a stable government together.
Great, thanks so much. Over to Jasper.
Yeah, thank you. I think Tom is totally right when it comes to polarization and personality in German politics and the stability of our Volkspartei, People's parties. But I just see one danger. If you look at the populists in Saxony, they are by far the strongest party there. They're reaching 30% or 25, 26%. They're stronger than each of the other parties. And if they can find some kind of a German Le Pen, then they're really a challenge for the other parties. And then you can observe, if you look at Markus Söder in the Bavarian leader of the sister party of the Conservatives, I think he tried something like a new type of a politician trying to get a very broad center vote area for himself, and that was his biggest point towards Armin Laschet, and I think we will have a discussion how the old Volksparteien can be stronger with personalities like Markus Söder or like we had it in the past, like Helmut Kohl, Gerhard Schröder, or you name it. So we will have this discussion in the next years, and it doesn't matter which coalition we have then, but it'll be an ongoing discussion.
Cecilia.
Yeah, I would like to talk about France to make maybe some clarification when it comes to compare French and Germany. I think in France, you have a very, very different system, political system. Everything is the most important election is an election for the president, for the presidency, and you have you had some years ago change of constitution, which means that the parliament and the presidency are at the same time. So you have a huge concentration on the personality of the president, which means that the polarization in the debate is much more important than in Germany. In Germany, you still have the system of representation where everybody has to talk to everybody. It doesn't come to one person who the winner takes it all. That's the French system. That's make a huge difference. And the success of Marine Le Pen. You have two main reasons. First reason that Macron made the political system explode. The parties, all parties don't exist anymore, and you have this second person, this opposition with Marine Le Pen, and she shifted to the center, so that she could gain more support from the rest, from the part of the political landscape on the right side. So that's a huge difference with Germany, and I think Germany still has this this system where everybody has to talk to everybody, and you cannot, and none of the party can have most of the votes, and that's a big difference. And I would add a last point: we lost in France, I think, due to the big importance of presidents, the capacity to talk to everyone. That's the reason why we had this huge episode of yellow vest. There are people who don't feel represented in any party, so they lost the trust in the capacity of political system to represent themselves, to represent them. And you don't find that in Germany. Maybe you will find that in former Eastern Germany. This lack of trust in the political system to represent them. That I would make those observation to make to underline the difference between France and Germany.
Thank you so much. Melissa, for a second, I thought that you were frozen because you so diligently held your hand like...
I can't find my Zoom hand today. I just wanted to make thank you for noticing my hand, Stormy. I wanted to say, well, first of all, just building on what Cécile said about the polarization and the inability to talk to each other, we own that. We started that in the United States, and it's a terrible way to do politics. But I have two thoughts. One is when I first came to Germany in the 1990s, everybody was up in arms about the Americanization of German politics and of German election campaigns. And at the time, I had no idea what they were talking about. I would say, though, for the first time, this time, we did see an Americanization of it, and nobody seemed to mind. And it was with this very tight focus on the personalities. And I personally think that is a legacy of Merkel, because she was such a big personality. She took all of the oxygen out of the room. She could run a campaign on, you know me. And then suddenly when she was gone, everybody kind of panicked, and you saw that there was a certain forgetting of how do we do campaigning again. You know, even in these Trielle, there was no foreign policy. Where was foreign policy in the Trielle? It was nowhere to be seen. But I think at the same time, we are living in an Instagram generation, and Instagram is all about the personality. And I think we saw, even with some of the issues that were coming up, Laschet laughing, the book, the plagiarizing the book, there's a tendency to look more with more scrutiny at the individual. And I think it's going to be hard to move away from that, even though, as somebody was pointing out in the chat, yes, a lot of the voters are still older voters, but we're starting to see that the politicians themselves, at least in Germany, not necessarily everywhere in the United States, we have younger people coming up, and they communicate differently, and they are more focused on individuals. And I think going forward, that certainly will have an impact on how campaigning will be done.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for pointing that out. I don't know if you saw that, but the Tagesspiegel has a really cool project where it analyzes the social media activities of the parties and the individual candidates, checking where they are active, how much their followers and how that looks like, and so on. It's really interesting. And what I found particularly interesting was taking a look at the hashtags and the concepts the different parties used. And what I found extremely, well, maybe not that surprising, but I think this is something which the parties still have to learn. For example, the CDU hardly ever used the hashtag climate. And that was so surprising, because they were on Instagram, which caters a lot to the younger people. And then you use the hashtag Heimat, and then you are surprised that that doesn't work. So I think there's a little bit of learning also to do with the new media, so to say. But let's hand over to Faye.
So I just wanted to make a comment on personalities, because in my country, for instance, it's all about the temperament of a leader. In what I found fascinating in Germany and Angela Merkel all these years is like, well, she lacked temperament, and maybe we would have wished for some more temperament and less logic sometimes on her part, but she managed to refrain from populism, from image making, from spinning the facts in a time of social media where image is everything. And this is highly appreciated, and maybe it's one of the reasons why, what you said before, Angela Merkel's popularity has grown even in Greece. For us, is something like a breath of fresh air, and I really hope that her successor keeps walking in the same path. I mean, I wouldn't like to see one more populist leader in Europe, in such a strong country as Germany, even more.
So unfortunately, time is getting really short, so we have to already get into our last round. Over the weekend, I listened to a podcast with Constanze Stelzenmüller. You all know her most likely. And she said Germany is a lot of times the 500-pound gorilla in the room who thinks he is a mouse and has not yet accepted its weight. And she also said it's when the gorilla turns, everybody else's windows are shaking, but the gorilla doesn't notice it. So my last question to all of you is looking over at the Chancellery and the next 4 years, what would be your foreign policy advice to the next Chancellor? What should he, it's probably going to be a he, take into account and maybe do differently, or continue doing as in the past? And I would like to start with you, Cécile.
Well, I would say keep going, taking responsibility for the world, and thinking European in the key. All of European countries, and especially with Paris, but thinking big. I think Germany started to do it, but go ahead.
Thank you so much, Cécile. Over to you, Tom.
I think the advice has to be that it's no longer possible, it probably hasn't been possible for quite a while now, for Germany to pretend that its preeminent role as a geo-economic power can be completely divorced from geopolitics. And you see that nowhere more obviously than in the growing competition between America and China, which of course is far from just being a military competition. It touches upon everything. It touches upon trade, upon technology, upon third-party diplomacy. There's been a very, very slow acknowledgement in some German circles that this has strong implications for Germany's place in the world, but it hasn't really yet penetrated to the top. And I think that's probably the #1 priority for the next German chancellor, is to understand that economics and politics no longer function in separate domains. And I have to leave now, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Tom. And over to you, Melissa.
I would echo what both Cécile and Tom just said and put it much more broadly, saying the Chancellery should understand that whether they want to or not, they are a power, and that power doesn't have to be feared. It can be respected and used wisely. And Germany is in a position to do that.
That's great. Thank you so much. And over to you, Faye.
Well, I would like to see the next chancellor exercising a little bit more attention on issues like human rights and civil society when it comes to foreign relations. And we haven't seen so much in the past. And I'm not only talking about like China, the obvious country, I'm talking also about Turkey, for instance, and some countries in Europe, even within Europe. So I would like to see more of that.
And last but not least Jasper.
I would give 3 points as an advice. First of all, you have to end the polarization within the European Union between East and West. That's the main part in the European policy, I guess. Second part would be the climate policy, and then you have to build up international diplomacy, be active on an international scale. And the third point is stop talking about responsibility internationally just on a theoretical level. Do something. I mean, change foreign policy in the direction of more responsibility.
Thank you so much. These were great last words, I have to say. So not just talk the talk of responsibility, but also walk the talk of responsibility. And Melissa, I very much also like what you said with regard to that power doesn't have to be feared if power and leadership are applied in a responsible and thoughtful way. And thank you also, Faye, for bringing in some policy areas, which I'm sure are going to be really important over the next years, human rights issues and climate issues. So let me end by underlying, these have not been just exciting elections. I think these are going to be exciting coalition negotiating times, and these are going to be 4 years of hopefully exciting German foreign policy making. And this was an exciting panel. These were exciting panelists and exciting insights. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will continue this dialogue. We will continue our Aspen international meetings, luncheons, and breakfasts, and hopefully next time we will see all of you, all of each other again in person. So thank you so much for joining us today. And then I wish all of us and all of you a happy election results analyzing time. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.